Hi, I'm Jane Wilson, and welcome to my final presentation. It's about DBT and mindfulness and treating transgender refugees that are suffering from PTSD. The United States has a complicated history of refugee treatment and asylum. In 1891, the Bureau of Immigration was established. Industrial revolution and the rise of major manufacturing cities attracted refugees to America from all over the world, many escaping religious and ethnic persecution, poverty, and famine. The Mexican Revolution destabilized Mexico from 1910 to 1920, leading to a mass influx of refugees in the southwest region of the United States. Racism and xenophobia impacted refugee asylum status from the very start. The Immigration Act of 1917 required all refugees over the age of 16 to pass a literacy test, something very difficult to do if you do not speak English. An ever-changing policy for refugees seeking asylum in the U.S. Global conflicts began to impact U.S. policy. The Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924, plus the rise of anti-Semitism, added up to many vulnerable populations being turned away and denied refugee status. Pictured here is Anne Frank. Refugees welcome. Well, kind of, sort of. Post-World War II, U.S. policy changes and welcomes refugees who had survived the atrocities in Europe, but with some caveats. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 assured that refugees would not displace any U.S. citizens in the workplace. This played into a false narrative that still exists to this day that refugees are stealing jobs from hardworking Americans. The Immigration and Nationality Act, or INA, the Refugee Relief Act, and the Hong Kong Parole Act. These were three acts. INA was the first put in place for a quota system for refugees and immigrants. A mass influx of refugee status applications from Chinese and Korean families escaping communism. The Hong Kong Parole Program further granted refugee asylum and pathway to citizenship for Chinese escaping communism. Cuba admitted as refugees 1961 to 1962. Cuba fell to communism and Fidel Castro dictatorship, and this allowed 58,000 Cuban refugees status and pathway to citizen within the United States. America's political decision makers always accepted refugees escaping from communist rule. The Indo-Chinese Immigration and Refugee Act. This is when the Vietnam War ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. U.S. welcomed refugees from Southeast Asia, many of whom had supported the U.S. efforts. By 1980, over 300 refugees in total had settled in the U.S. from Southeast Asia. Political climate versus human dignity. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free is now challenged by a continued thread of xenophobia, Islamophobia, racism, and seeing people as the other. We see here pictured refugees after the revolution in Iran in 1979, refugee influx after the Iraq-Iran War in 1991, and Ronald Reagan's granting of amnesty to millions of Mexican American and Asian Americans in 1986. Did we do that? The U.S. has also been the great destabilizer. U.S. intelligence and CIA backing of narco-terrorism in Central America and Mexico. Destabilization of the entire sugar industry in Haiti by U.S. corporate, supported by the U.S. government. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which decimated the Mexican economy, ecosystem, and infrastructure. The U.S. has a history of coming in like a wrecking ball and then taking zero accountability. The 9/11 terrorist attacks changed everything and further divided us. September 11th, 2001 equals American protectionism on the uptake, a war without end, increased fear-mongering of, again, the other. And the Department of Homeland Security was created, and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, was now 3 new agencies: the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services, Immigrations and Custom Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE, and U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, CBP. There's never been adequate oversight or accountability of any of these agencies. The Obama era. President Obama attempted to claw back some of the post-9/11 fear-mongering. His administration fought for an expedited intake of refugees from Kurdistan, Syria, and Central America. but he was rightly criticized for inadequate resources for this massive influx that happened in 2014. Enter the Trump hellscape. With the election of President Donald Trump, the U.S. took a hard turn into cruelty as he denigrated and demonized refugees, immigrants, LGBTQ communities, and Black Lives Matter. The Trump administration engaged in human rights abuses in 2018 as refugees arrived in caravans from Central America, separating children from their parents, losing documentation of where the children were sent to be processed. Further, he weaponized the COVID crisis against asylum seekers, passing of Title 42, which is using public health concerns to make asylum seekers remain in Mexico. In fact, that's what the policy is called, remain in Mexico. Amnesty International have labored tortured the separation of families under Title 42 and the detention and incarceration of refugees seeking their legitimate right to asylum. The UN has labeled genocide the kidnapping of a child from a parent wherein no paper trail is created, thus making reunification impossible. Now we turn to trans refugees in peril and the focus of my group that I'd like to create. Trans refugees who present at the border for asylum after being persecuted in their country of origin have a legal right to seek asylum, are usually in life-threatening situations. Under the Trump administration, they were either being turned away to remain in Mexico or detained by Border Patrol and placed in detention, where the reports of abuse, physical, sexual, mental, emotional, misgendering are well documented and pervasive. Due to a decision by the Supreme Court, Title 42 has yet to be rescinded, despite efforts by the Biden administration. Bonded out to a new life. Since 2017, hundreds of trans refugees have been held by Border Patrol unlawfully, kept in detention, and then bonded out by lawyers working for human rights groups and settled in communities across the U.S. A very large population of these survivors are in Los Angeles County and receiving services through LA County and various crisis intervention services. They need our support. My group, DBT and Mindfulness Support Group. This will include mindfulness, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, and walking the middle path, which is also known as backing away from black and white thinking and practicing acceptance. My group will be held at the LGBTQ Center in Hollywood. This is where they would come for their 4-part group. The group would consist of 7 or 8 clients meeting weekly for 4 weeks. The session would take place for 2 hours with 1 10-minute break. Week 1 would be intros and grounding work, working on sensory stuff. Grounding helps with anxiety, anger, and focus. Week 2, distress tolerance skills. I would use the accepts model, which involves activities, contributing, comparisons, emotions, pushing away thoughts and sensation, and the distress tolerance skill of TIP. That involves change-up of temperature, involving intense exercise, paced breathing, and paired muscle relaxation. Week 3 would be acceptance and commitment therapy approaches and SMART goals. Acceptance and commitment starts with diffusion. It moves into acceptance, being present, values clarification, committed action, and then also looking at self as context. SMART goals involve specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound goals for the very near future. Week 4 would involve yoga, meditation, and breathworks, an introduction to all 3 of these things. The need in the community. We're at a crisis point in the US regarding trans rights and trans protections. 43% of Americans believe that children who present as trans to their parents should not be given gender-affirming care. Trans people are more likely to fall into marginalized living situations and employment that places their lives in peril. Social workers are tasked, it is our code of ethics to stand up for the dignity and the worth of every human being. Group evaluation. This group would have me as a facilitator and a therapist, a bilingual support communicator. I will ask clients about their favorite snacks and beverages and bring these for them so they would not have to supply them themselves. More evaluation. Everybody needs to get up to speed and get educated on sensitivity to the trans community. This gives you some examples of the do's, such as We do ask what pronouns they like to use. We do change their name on the roster. We ask how to best support the student in any given space. We don't ask them about their pre-transition life. We don't ask them about medical or surgery questions, etc. Further facts to inspire change. So far in 2023, there have been 340 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced into state legislatures in America, which is a record. 150 of those bills have been specifically anti-trans, which is also a record. When you pass laws criminalizing a sexuality lifestyle choice, you send a message, especially to vulnerable LGBTQ children and teens, that their lives are not valuable. This is why there has been an increase in self-harm, bullying of, and suicide death among this population. Again, call your representatives in Congress, and if necessary, your local and state representatives, and tell them loudly and clearly to end trans detentions. Please fight and be aware and end Title 42. Trans rights are human rights. Thank you so much for listening to and reading my presentation. I'm Jane Wilson, and it's been a pleasure sharing this information with you.